закаляется Родины сталь. Россия, Россия, в этом слове огонь и сила, в этом слове победы и пламя, поднимаем России знамя. Россия, Россия, в этом слове огонь и сила, в этом слове победы и пламя, поднимаем России знамя. Пусть время...
The world ended as it did, with the three nations dominating everything from trade, economics, and war. It's hard to imagine, yet also easy, had something gone ever so slightly differently, that this world would simply not be the same. But one of the most often thought of scenarios is clear. What if Venoria didn't lose Operation Devis? Now, before we actually dive into the topic, we need to go over why Venoria lost the war. Don't worry, I'll make this segment quite short. First, we must understand that the conflict started mainly because of Venorian ambitions to expand. But why is this? Upon further analysis and multiple interviews with former veterans, the general answer would be the orders of the parliament, which had grown out of the king's control. This meant that the individuals the king previously handpicked had suddenly become beyond aggressive and acted against the king's orders, leading to the war. The king himself wanted great relations with Ocean, but the parliament had quite different ideas in mind, hoping to reach the mythical empire Devis once had in Alpha, according to legend. So even if the Venorians won the war, they would have to experience a civil war which would have given the chance for everyone to rebel, leading to an almost instant downfall. However, for the purpose of this video, we may have to temporarily ignore this and assume the king is aligned with the parliament in some way. Now, that is the political background out of the way. We may now focus on the actual war. The main plan the Venorians had was to use overwhelming manpower, which would have come out of their dominions and their ally, the Pumies. In the real world, the Pumies and the dominion of Locust never arrived. One had simply refused to arrive, while the other turned out to be a traitor and anti-Venorian aligned. For Venoria to succeed, they would have to give all members roughly a week or two in order to mobilize their armies and attack at the exact same time. Meanwhile, Venoria would have to secure the loyalty of all its dominions firmly, likely by replacing some of the people running them violently, in a purge that would be alike to Ferenczov's reign of terror in the Falklands. Those were the main contributing factors to why Venoria lost the actual battle in the air. However, it is highly unlikely Bartland and Strahlen would have collapsed after a single battle, so Venoria would have to make sure the members of the coalition consistently arrived to every battle to hold their manpower advantage to overwhelm the enemy with missiles and other things. When the majority of the air force is defeated, they could at last prepare for their advance on the ground, which may not last long once again due to the manpower, as they could have a majority both on the ground and in the air, giving support to each other as one army would. Of course, the strategy of overwhelming manpower would result in a severe number of deaths. However, considering both sides are armed with roughly the same type of equipment, that would be highly unlikely. Of course, this section on how they would win the war is all full of excuses, which is why Operation Devis never succeeded. It never addressed any of those problems and rushed through without a plan, but had the coalition consistently gone through everything together, they might have had a slim chance. Of course, you didn't click the video to hear about what actually happened, you came here to hear about what could have. Now, the next order of events would be relatively unknown. The plan barely addressed many things, but we can assume that if one nation collapsed after a ground invasion, the other might surrender by then. Finally, we reach an actual plan part, the aftermath. Without doubt, the thing we all hated Operation Devis for and loved its failure was its planned aftermath, which would have given us a world not like this, but like this. This world would likely have two different outcomes, and we will discuss the most likely one, which would be delayed collapse. As I said before, this scenario would assume the king aligned with the parliament, which would not cause an immediate civil war throughout the empire. However, it is still likely that there would be extreme partisan activity within Bartland and Strahlen, leading to Venoria slowly expending its resources there alongside Puma and Economy. Over what I would estimate to be 3 months, Bartland, Strahlen and Locust would launch their final push towards independence by rebelling at the exact same time throughout all their territories. It would be likely Puma would see this as a lost fight, while Phoenix might also join the rebellion. Due to the overwhelming odds, Venoria would be forced to leave all the nations, likely willingly. However, the new coalition would likely not be satisfied by that, seeing the reign of absolute authority their masters once had as absolutely disgraceful. A war for revenge would follow shortly after the rebellions, which would ironically have resulted in a world somewhat more similar to how it is now. With the most realistic scenario out of the way, we may now discuss the TNO of the La Junta universe. The Empire never falls. Instead of long fights, the Empire would defeat the enemies one by one, alike to how the final Venorian rebellion played out in the real world with a decisive defeat at the hands of the Zut. In this timeline, it would be likely Venoria would constantly interfere in pan-continental affairs, such as in Bravo or Pre-Alpha to their liking. Effectively, this would be a world where Vinorification would occur. Similar to how Strahlan mass deported and committed various atrocities against Venorian people in our world, it is likely Venoria would do it back with little to no regard for their culture other than their own. This world would see a significant Venorian population for certain, and can even be compared to 1984, alike to the current standard of living in VOV. However, instead of the regional scale atrocities we see in our world regarding Venorian culture, this would likely be large-scale and global. Exactly what extent Vinorification would go to or if it would even happen is unknown, but it is likely the kingdom would do everything possible to keep its crown on its head, giving us the world with the green crown above us all. For an average citizen, this may mean living in severely underfunded locations and being left to fend for themselves, while cities targeted by Vinorification would experience the opposite, being hubs for their islands and everything from trade to diplomacy. This would have influenced many people to turn to Vinorification, by drastically reducing their standard of living but promising a better life in exchange for surrendering their identities. Truly a brutal fate. And I'm not going to draw comparisons because you already know who I'm going to point to anyways. Even to me, somebody who was quite literally a Venorian patriot a long time ago, this idea would sound horrific. Yet, in some ways it would be ironic, mainly against Strahlan though. Even so, the forced conversion of cultures is definitely not something I support whatsoever, even in La Junta. The only moderately acceptable outcome would be for the Empire to simply not feature Vinorification. However, as I mentioned, we do not know if they would truly implement such measures to prevent rebellion. Remember, my viewers, ocean prevailed so you wouldn't have to sleep in a world where the only thing above you is the green crown.